start. Welcome everybody to our third speaker in the Center for East Asian Studies Global Asia Speaker Series. My name is Akiko Takeyama. I'm Director of Center for East Asian Studies, and I am especially so excited tonight talk by Professor David Rowe, who does so many different things, and especially bringing so many different elements into his talk. So let me start to introduce Professor David Rowe. David Rowe is Associate Professor of English and Director of the Digital Matters Lab at the University of Utah. And by the way, this website is just amazing. So if you're interested in, check out this Digital Matter Lab at the University of Utah. Meanwhile, his research specializes in Asian American literature and digital humanities. He is the author of Minor Transpacific, Triangulating American, Japanese, and Korean fictions, published from Stanford University Press. And this year actually just came out this past summer. He's also the author of Illegal Literature Toward a Disruptive Creativity, published with University of Minnesota Press in 2015, and a co-editor of Techno-Orientalism, Imagining Asian in Speculative Fiction, History, and Media, with Rutgers University Press in 2015. Professor Rowe is a recipient of numerous prestigious honors and awards. To name a few, Summer Residency Fellowship at the National Humanities Center in 2019, Institute for Advanced Topics in the Digital Humanities at the National Endowment for the Humanities in 2017, and Rising Star in the Humanities Award at the University of Utah in 2016. Today, Professor Rowe gives us a talk entitled Mira Transpacific, Articulating the Zainichi Korean and the Korean American Conversation. I am especially so pleased to have Professor Rowe tonight with us. So please welcome Professor David Rowe.
Thank you so much, Professor Takayama. I also want to say thank you to Lucretia Kopp and Amanda Snyder for making the event and doing all the work behind the scenes, and of course, CEAS. It's really my privilege to share my work with you here tonight. I want to start off by telling you a story. After graduating from college, I spent a year teaching English in a city called Okazaki near Nagoya, Japan. And I had spent some time there, and I just happened to stumble upon a new Korean restaurant that had opened up in town. And I just walked in and started talking, exchanging some pleasantries with the owner, and asked him in Korean, when was the last time you were in Hanguk, Korea, right? Or South Korea, I should say, which I would always had equated that term with the entirety of Korea. And he said, well, I actually have never gone because I can't. And I said, well, why is that? Because you're so close. And he said, well, it's because I'm North Korean. I can't go to South Korea. And I was really kind of dumbstruck at that moment because it was my first encounter with somebody who was North Korean, even though I'm of Korean descent. And all my life, my parents had told me stories about the Pachinko commies and the Reds in North Korea. And so I had this kind of very one-dimensional idea of what North Koreans were, right? And I was kind of struck because in that moment, I was, he spoke Japanese with a slight Korean inflection, or Korean with a slight Japanese inflection. I spoke Korean with a stumbling American accent. And we were both kind of alleging ourselves to these national allegiances, even though he was probably born in Japan, or he was born in Japan. I was born in America, and we're both ethnic Koreans. But in this middle space of Japan, that encounter kind of destabilized, at least for me, my notions of what it meant to be Korean American and affiliated with South Korea, right? And so there are these gravitational, the gravitational pull of these state allegiances kind of intervene in that very human mode of contact. And I left that restaurant feeling really unmoored and didn't really quite know how to conceptualize that encounter. And so the book that I wrote, in some ways, it was kind of a way for me to work through that moment, right? So this talk is really, it's drawn from my book project, Minor Transpacific, which is this comparative study of Asian American and Korean American ethnic literature, Korean Japanese ethnic literature, I should say. So I'm going to give you some snapshots of the book, and hopefully that'll paint a picture of the overarching argument. And I'd be happy to elaborate during the Q&A in the more imagistic parts of the talk. Right. So as I said, Minor Transpacific is a multilingual study of two diasporic literature traditions, Korean American and Zainichi Bungaku, a Korean Japanese literature. And now these are subjects are traditionally studied in isolation, Asian and Asian American studies. But I argue that these fictions are actually engaged in a kind of trans-Pacific conversation. And to comprehend that relationship, it requires our building of a theory of minor literatures and the median sites that they travel through, right? In this case, Japan and the United States. So this would involve a critique of both fields. I'm going to say this is a loving critique, but a critique nonetheless. And that speaks to the need for Asian American studies, on one hand, to expand beyond the domestic, right? And for Asian studies and area studies writ large, to engage with theories of racial formation. So to ground that argument, we first have to do a little foundational work. We have to first understand the shift towards interdisciplinary dialogue. Now, there is a problem with an historical tension between the two fields. The reluctance for them to engage with one another is perhaps a legacy of their historical alignments, area studies with national intelligence, and ethnic studies with 1960s student activism. So as a result, there's been this kind of structural disincentive for Asian American studies to turn eastward. And I'm pulling a quote here from Janet Hoskins and Viet Thanh Nguyen's book, Transpacific Studies, who articulate how there's a kind of political oppositional disincentive for the two fields to engage. So, I anecdotally, I know of folks in Asian studies who were interested in exploring Asian American studies in grad school, but that wasn't the kind of inquiry that was necessarily rewarded or incentivized in area studies. So that interest tends to dissipate as they work towards job market and tenure. That work isn't as legible according to disciplinary contours. And the reverse is true as well. There aren't very many Asian American studies programs that encourage or require a second language, which then creates a kind of barrier for the kind of interdisciplinary work that would facilitate this kind of exploration. So that ends up, the result is that Asian American studies tends to focus on the US as the site of cultural and political formation, and tends not to account for intermediary Asian sites. Now, there were some calls for corrective measures that grew out of the 1990s. Asian American Studies field, it had a desire, early on, it had a desire to claim America and to legitimate Asian American racial identity, which led to a binary in which Asia was perceived as the kind of distant homeland. We've moved beyond Asia, right? We're going to move past that. So in response, critics such as, I hope you can see that, Lisa Lowe, Susan Koshy, Candace Chu, and Laura Kang, they began to theorize and complicate Asian American literature. In the fields of Asian studies, multilingual studies traversing multiple national sites have emerged, particularly in Japanese Empire studies. Christopher Hanscom, Dennis Washburn, Takashi Fujitani, over in Asian America, these books are examples of the kind of works that engage with racial formation theory. And over in Asian American studies, scholars started to consider Asian literatures in transnational context. People like Denise Cruz, King Kok Chung, Nito Huang, Josephine Park. And by pulling from multiple sites and discourses, these works do the interdisciplinary work of connecting bodies across disciplines to unveil new critical terrains. So the first thing I'm trying to do is take another step here, take it one step further, that we should encourage a comparative minority framework beyond the domestic. And relatedly, there has been a push towards theorizing a minor transnationalism. François Lyonnais and Shumei Shi note that the formulation of a minority discourse emerged within American studies as a way of theorizing diversity. But this approach to diversity remains largely monolingual, even though multilinguality is a given within minority communities. So when non-US forms of transnationalism and transcolonialism are brought into play, the minority discourse model is pretty limited because not all minorities are minoritized by the same mechanisms in different places. There's no universal minority position as such. So what they offer, they posit a minor transnationalism that rejects monolingualism, that's built on the premise of hybridity and exchange, and is decoupled from the colonial center beyond the and goes beyond the colonizer colonized binary. So in other words, a comprehensive understanding of both Asian and Asian American texts occurs only through this kind of comparative engagement. Right? So with that being said, let's return to Korean diasporic literatures. So I need to spend a little bit of time giving you this really brief overview of the history of Zainichi in Japan, in case you're not already familiar with it. Zainichi Koreans, this is a propaganda poster put out by colonial Imperial Japan, basically saying, united, we are the supreme people, Korea and Japan, right? So Zainichi Koreans actually have a more robust history of migration to Japan compared to Korean American immigration. Japan had annexed Korea in 1910 and began pushing out funneling resources to the colonial center. And by 1938, there were about 800,000 Koreans living and working in Japan. And World War II saw this explosion of growth with mass involuntary migration. So by 1945, it was estimated there were 2.3 million Koreans living in Japan. So in the early 1940s, Japanese rulers in Korea launched a campaign dubbed Japan and Korea as One to create local subjects of the Koreans. So this involved a number of things: abolishing the Korean language, adoption of Korean name or Japanese names, and basically trying to assimilate Koreans to the colonial center, at the same time keeping them at arm's length, right? So when Japan surrendered in 1945, the Zainichi celebrated because they were liberated, right? But then quickly found themselves in this kind of statelessness, a state of limbo. With both Korea and Japan in ruins, a lot of them repatriated to Korea, but about 600,000 decided to stay behind. And for them, it wasn't really easy life in Japan, right? The Zainichi, who during the colonial period were technically considered citizens of the empire, were suddenly, not citizens anymore. They're foreigners again. And the Allied occupying forces, who were mainly concerned with rebuilding Japan, left the question of their rights and legal status up to the state, which again wanted really nothing to do with them. So with the normalization of relations between Japan and South Korea in 1965, the Zainichi were finally kind of given the option of claiming South Korean citizenship, which left those who remained ideologically aligned with the North still without a state. So it wasn't until the 80s, early 80s, that non-South Korean Zainichi could apply for a general permanent resident status. So you can see kind of like the tortured history here, the many kind of band-aids and ad hoc nature of legislation and policy that finally gave a place for the Zainichi, right? But even then, what it meant to be a permanent alien meant that the Zainichi weren't allowed to take part in electoral politics, access social welfare benefits, and were basically openly discriminated against in the public and private sectors. And also attended were these kind of humiliating exercises such as ward registration for alien residents, including mandatory fingerprinting at 14 years old, which to many Zainichi intimated a kind of inherent criminality. And you can see in this photo here, some Zainichi activists opposing the fingerprinting practice. So it's belatedly, only recently, that a domestic identity fusing Japanese and Korean emerges, right? So several generations deep at a kind of delayed rate. And this is a citation from John Lee's Zainichi. But that's not to say that the Zainichi intellectual and literary community didn't spend considerable time wrestling with the question of what it meant to be Zainichi. And if you read the literature, and much of it does grapple with issues about recurring issues about citizenship, colonialism, ethno-nationalism, legislative alienation, and then passing is another big one. So, but even the term Zainichi reflects the politics of their conditional acceptance. If you look at the term, the emphasis is on Kankokujin or Chosenjin, right? And Zainichi is sort of the modifier, right? So you are, semantically speaking, if not in sentiment, a perpetual foreigner. Compare that to Korean American, with the emphasis on American and Korean being the modifier, right? So you can see how it's flipped in Japan, right? So that's to say that there's extensive body of Zainichi literature out there that's got a long, rich history. That there's an engagement, I think I'm trying to uncover between the Zainichi literature and Asian American literature and Korean American literature, and specifically more than that, Asian America does seek to engage with Zainichi, and I'll illustrate that with my discussion of Minjin's Pachinko a little bit later. And to articulate that engagement, to fully comprehend it, we need a theory of the minor mediated Transpacific to capture it. So I grew up in Los Angeles. For a long time, my understanding of Korean America, whether rightly or wrongly, began and ended with K-Town, Koreatown. Later, maybe there may be Koreans in New York, maybe New Jersey, some random city here and there, right? And my understanding of Korean America started in 1965 and never ended, right? And that's, in retrospect, it's a very myopic view of what Korean America is, and it's much more complicated than that. So I'm gonna tell you a really embarrassing story. Okay, it's a story about the playground, right? I was a kid in elementary school, and some of my classmates came up to me at the playground, and they asked me if I liked this other classmate, the only other Asian American student in my class. And liked her, and I kind of panicked, and I didn't know what to say, and I said, no, I don't like this person because she's Japanese, right? And the two classmates of mine who had asked me this, they were not Asian American, and they were just very confused by my reaction, and I was confused by my reaction, and they left, and I just kind of like asked myself, why did I say that? Why did I say I don't like her because she's Japanese, right? And it's because, in retrospect, I can think back, and I think it's because, my understanding of Korean America was always tied to Japan, and a lot of antipathy and colonial era trauma that my parents and my grandparents had experienced, and they had passed on to me. And so even though I hadn't consciously decided to discriminate against Japanese Americans or Japanese, in that moment, it emerged, right, on an unconscious level, right? And so what that signals to me is that my understanding of Korean America has always been more complicated and more complex than I acknowledged, right? And that it always had been in relation to Imperial Japan. And so what I'm trying to do here is apply that lesson to Korean American fiction. So I'm talking about two novels today, Minjun Lee's Pachinko and Kim Masumi's Motosulka. And so I hope some of you are familiar with Pachinko, maybe not so much with Motosulka, but I thought these are two works that are interesting illustrations of the conundrum that they bring for both fields of Asian studies and Asian American studies. So for example, which discipline does a book like Pachinko belong to? And after all, the subject matter maybe belongs to Japanese studies or perhaps even Korean studies. And this is a novel that's written entirely in English by a Korean American author whose first book belongs squarely in Asian American studies. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's called Free Food to Millionaires, and it covers it's about a bunch of Asian American characters who are in New York City in high finance. But her second book is quite different, right? So which discipline does it belong to? And the novel itself isn't restricted by national boundaries. It explicitly introduced it, even though it's primarily about Zainichi characters in Japan. It introduces characters and ideas from Asian America and imports them to a Zainichi context. Similarly, Motosulka is written in Japanese, set against the backdrop of a distinctly American side of national trauma. That's the 1992 Los Angeles Uprising, Los Angeles riots. And it's written by a Zainichi Korean author. And this book is a novella. It centers on the relationship between a Zainichi Korean character and her Korean American friends, but the framing is entirely Zainichi, right? But for most Asian American scholars, Motosulka would not even register, right, based on the language barrier alone. And even then, there's a question about whether we can consider this, something to be studied or something to be framed in an Asian American context. So the way that I'm trying to deal with that is to frame them as minor literatures being mediated through the US and Japan, right? What I'm calling a diasporic minority transposition. They operate in similar ways. First, the novels are written in their adopted languages for domestic readership with a dual purpose, right? They are interested in speaking to their particular audience, right? Pachinko is interested in speaking to an American readership, and Motosulka is interested in speaking to a Japanese readership, right? But it's with the purpose, right, to introduce a foreign body of racial discourse to that readership, and to occupy that space to reconceptualize domestic minoritization, right, to reframe it or to revisit it. Second, they explicitly involve representations of homeland minority discourse, right? So what I mean by that is that in Pachinko, that involves a Korean American character who is thrust into the Zainichi sphere, much to her bewilderment. And in Motosulka, the Zainichi protagonist has to navigate a very alien racial climate environment at a very fraught and explosive period, right? And finally, the books, they decenter the dominant structures of power to the background. So in Pachinko, there's not like a main Japanese landowner who is like the main antagonist of the novel. That's there, but it's abstracted, right? It's kind of pushed in the background. And similarly, in Motosulka, there's no like, overbearing racist policemen acting as protagonists. And again, it's there, but it's kind of pushed into the background, right? So let me go to the next slide here. By decentering those structures of power and abstracting them, they signal, as Shimashura and Francois Lindley write, a recognition of the creative interventions that networks of minoritized cultures produce within and across national boundaries. So if we could apply this to other frames, you can think of other possible connections between, let's say, Vietnamese American literature and Vietnamese French literature, or Filipino American literature and the Japanese period in Filipino literature, right? It kind of opens up this network opens up relationships between these bodies of works that can engage, right, in an intellectually satisfying way. So in 2019, President Obama posted a list of books he found compelling. And it's fitting that Pachinko resonate with him, who he's called himself America's first Pacific president and was even referred to as the first Asian American president. And it makes sense because Obama's multi-ethnic background and multiply located identity as a Black American makes him kind of like the ideal reader for Pachinko, right? It's got these universalist themes of resilience and compassion, and that would find an audience with the broader American readership, despite I'm assuming the broader American readership had sort of a minimal awareness of the history between Korea and Japan. And it kind of had a lot of, enjoyed a lot of fanfare in the American reading community. But I would argue that Pachinko wasn't the first direct gesture by or about Zainichi Korea. Instead, it was a response to a call that preceded by some 20 years. And I'll get to that a little bit later. So for those of you who have not read Pachinko, it's this kind of sprawling Dickensian study. Min Jin Lee's novel follows a couple of different generations of Zainichi characters, beginning in Jeju Island in Korea, ending in contemporary Tokyo with this kind of offstage sojourn through New York City. And the novel begins with Sunja, a young Korean woman in Jeju-do, who encounters two young men, and they're both inflected by Western modernity in some ways, right? So there's this infirmed Christian minister, young man named Baek Isak, and this kind of glamorous gangster named Ko Han-soo. And their encounter leads to her bearing two sons, the brash Mozasu, named after Moses, and the intellectual Noah, named after Noah, who both end up in the shameful, illicit pachinko gambling industry. And then Mozasu's son, Solomon, Sunja's grandkid, takes over the family pachinko business, and the end of the novel is him breaking this cycle of shame and tragedy. And so possible, as the characters experience different forms of discrimination and racism against them in Japan, there are several different modes here that offer them perhaps a solution, right? So one solution is to Japanese discrimination might be Western modernity, but not white Western modernity, right? And that leads to some of the characters thinking of the U.S. as a kind of mythical fantasy land. And that fantasy fascination is inherited by Sunja's extended family. Mozasu's wife, Yumi, before she passed away in this car accident, she becomes fixated with the idea of the US, with America's kind of alterity beyond the Ikaino ghetto, right? And after she passes away and her aspirations are cut short, Mozasu and Solomon, they pick up where they left off, where she left off, right? And the second half of their transition begins with Solomon's education, which he undertakes entirely in English, speaking Japanese at home, and a smattering of Korean with his grandmother. And so, Mozasu, makes sure that Solomon goes to an international school in Yokohama because he likes this idea of Westerners. And Solomon eventually grows up and goes to Columbia University in New York City. And that would, you would think that would bring the family legitimation project to a close, right? He's mastered English, he lives in New York, he works in the knowledge industry. It's in a long-term relationship with a Korean American woman. But he still faces some familiar barriers associated with his foreignness, right? So for example, when this company ships him back to Tokyo as part of their branch campus, he tries to rent an apartment, but because he's technically considered an alien resident, he needs a guarantor on his lease, which his girlfriend Phoebe, his Korean American girlfriend, finds completely outrageous, right? And this is kind of exacerbated by Solomon's sort of blasé response to this, right? So even the social capital of his working for an American investment firm, that doesn't really go that far, because eventually he's fired over a real estate deal that his father's associates assist in. And it's made clear that nothing illegal happened, but because of the inherent criminality of Zainichi and their involvement, the firm has to cut ties with Solomon because there's a skittish Japanese clientele, right? So Solomon walks away, understanding that he can't really escape his racialization, and as a Zainichi through or by American capital, though increasingly multinational, it's still ruled by the local constructs of race, right? So, I alluded to the fact that the novel consciously avoids appealing to white Western modernity, and that's symptomatic of the kind of decentering imperative in both Pachinko and Motosulka. But it does detour through Korean America, which might, to some of the characters, mean the perfect amalgamation of Western modernity, social capital, and citizenship. And as I had mentioned, it mostly is embodied in the form of Phoebe, Solomon's girlfriend, who he meets in college. And he's drawn to her confidence, her brashness, and he convinces her to come to Tokyo with him. But her integration to Solomon's life in Japan appears to be, pretty stunted. And Phoebe, she might intellectually understand Solomon's family's history, but it doesn't really assuage her misgivings about Japan, right? So she knows that their respective migrations or the histories of migration are different, as are their racializations. But she seems to be, unwilling to make sense of Solomon's positionality. And so from her perspective, Solomon's conditional residency is just highly offensive, right? And it stems from her understanding of her lineage and citizenship having never been in question, right? Or not to the extent that Solomon experiences, right? So when she is faced with another paradigm as a Korean American visitor, she kind of reacts with this kind of violent outrage, right? And she's this kind of insular Korean American who refuses to temporarily transpose herself or understand or empathize with the Zainichi subject, and that leads ultimately to their going their separate ways. Right, Phoebe's Korean American entitlement and confidence that initially Solomon finds really intoxicating while he's in the U.S., but when placed in Japan, her history seems to be incongruous with his own. So, as Zainichi intellectuals have theorized, Solomon tries to carve out a third way beyond the Korea-Japan binary and the United States back road. So he decides that leads to his deciding to stay in the Pachinko business to kind of flip the script, reverse the decades of shame that has haunted his family and their past, right? And I'm skipping up whole important swaths of the novel here, and I can expand upon that in the Q&A. But my point in dwelling on this comparative dimension of Pachinko is to underscore the fact that for Minjin Lee, her interest in Zainichi was always comparatively oriented, right? She was always fascinated by the racializations of Koreans in the US and Japanese contexts, right? And in an interview, and I'm pulling this up in the New York Times article, she confesses that her interest in the Zainichi stems from previously complete ignorance about their existence, right? So you can read Solomon's decision to return to the Pachinko business as a kind of tacit critique, right? That the Korean American model is not really a viable solution for the Zainichi because of the difference in their respective histories and the particulars of their minoritizations, right? But what's really interesting is that the plot kind of parallels Lee's first novel, Free Food for Millionaires, in which several Korean American characters in New York's finance industry spurn capitalism for more fulfilling ventures. That's exactly what Solomon does in Pachinko, right? So you can see there's always a kind of there's a tie there, right? That there's a relationship between her first novel and her second novel, and the impetus of that of Pachinko is not just the insular, isolated fascination with Zainichi, but she was actively trying to compare Korean American and Zainichi contexts. So you could read Solomon's decision could, his coming to terms with the unique situatedness of Zainichi, but I think, maybe it's perhaps both, right? Lee's novel is about the Zainichi, but it's also a projection and an extension of Korean America, right? And likewise, Kim Masumi's Motosulka is also an expansive meditation on Zainichi Korea, even though it ostensibly is about Korean America. So taking place over the span of a single day during the 92 LA uprising, Motosulka jumps back and forth and traverses the United States and Japan, right? So the Zainichi Korean protagonist Ryoko is driving around the city with her Korean American friend Midon, and they weave through traffic, they weave through riders by way of Koreatown, Little Tokyo, to South Central convenience store Sōka, Grass House, owned and operated by Midon's husband Kim, right? And during this time, Ryoko confesses to Midon that she thinks she's pregnant, and they discuss her plans for naturalization, gaining citizenship to Japan, so that she and her husband can access the privileges of citizenship, to which Midon and Kim object to varying degrees. And the novella ends with the destruction of the store, the convenience store. Has the title Burning Grass House, right? So you can see it's drawing upon the story of the Three Little Pigs. So just as the Pachinko parlor operates as a metaphor for the positionality of the Zainichi in Pachinko, the titular Sōka has a similar metaphorical function, right? So it's located in South Central LA, primarily Black neighborhood, and the store could be read as this kind of read ambiguously as a site of opportunity and prosperity for the Korean American owners, or fragility and the object of hostility, mirroring Midon's and Kim's place in the U.S. as Korean Americans, and Ryoko's own conditional acceptance in Japan and Zainichi. So I wanted to talk about several modes of racialization that occur in Motosulka that kind of bring into stark relief the difference between the Zainichi Korea and Korean America, right? So Ryoko, her central preoccupation in the novel is with citizenship. She's filed for paperwork for naturalizing, just as her husband has already done back in Japan. And for those of you who don't already know, naturalization for Zainichi is a pretty freighted political matter. For many first and second generation Zainichi, who have resisted fierce pressure to assimilate and erase their Koreanness and erase their Korean history. Politically, naturalization is tantamount to betrayal, like ethnic and national betrayal, right? But you see this pressure and attitude changing as Zainichis have gone to the third generation, the fourth generation, right? But in the novel, the pressure for her to retain her South Korean citizenship doesn't just come from her friends, but her family. And her father's dying wish was that she never naturalized, right? He initially opposed her marriage because her husband had already naturalized, and she tries to come up with a compromise by saying, okay, I'll just wait till he passes away so he doesn't have to witness this, right? And also Ryoko has these aspirations to teach at a national university, which won't hire non-citizens, and she worries that her remaining a foreigner in Japan will eventually alienate her from her husband and her unborn child. And what's interesting is, to me, in this novel is that there's an exchange that Ryoko has with Kim, the owner of the store, who is a Korean American, probably first generation Korean American, and he criticizes her decision to naturalize, right? And you see this in this exchange, she talks about going to Japan, and you can see he is upset, and he tells her that you have sold out, right? And she stares in surprise because Kim had used the word sold, right? And what's interesting to me is that this is clearly a projection, right? Because I don't think a Korean American who's already naturalized would, unless he was a fierce nationalist for some reason, wouldn't object so strongly to Ryoko's decision, right? And so there's multiple layers here, right? First, Kim and Ryoko's discussion is mediated through consumer goods, these meat products, and the store sort of operates as kind of discursive site of racial formation. And second, Kim and Miryon's objection to her plan, to Ryoko's plan, is a projection of second generation Zainichi attitudes towards naturalized. So Masumi is having, or Kim Masumi is having these characters kind of, she's been ventriloquizing through these characters some of the, I think, attitudes that Zainichi would have in Japan, right? And third, the entire exchange is conducted in English because Ryoko doesn't really speak Korean fluently, even if the text is in Japanese. So you can see like multiple levels of linguistic displacement here. And the discussion of Korean and Japanese citizenship is mediated through this, the space of the U.S. and America and Los Angeles. It's undergoing its own crisis, right? But it's also in this third national space and language that Ryoko is allowed to step outside of Zainichi politics in some ways, and gives her the latitude to reconceptualize how she's going to maybe reframe her interiority, her identity, right? And the thing that she fears the most is passing, right? At several points throughout the novel, Ryoko, who presents as Japanese, has to create people's assumptions in the US, right? She's often mistaken for Japanese or Chinese, definitely not Korean, right? And most distress, and you see this here when she encounters a Korean woman in LA, and she speaks Korean to her, but the woman assumes that she's Chinese, right? So most distressingly, Ryoko finds others projecting Imperial Japan onto her body. There's another encounter in the store where an elderly Korean woman overhears Ryoko speaking Japanese and then confronts her in Japanese, right? And she insinuates here, that you must be Japanese and you are responsible, or you are an inheritor of this colonial trauma that I experienced and my village experience, right? And in those moments of projection, in those moments of being mistaken, Ryoko finds herself to be paralyzed, right? And doesn't have really any other option than to kind of take the old woman's animus, right? And she can't answer in Korean because she doesn't have that linguistic ability. And replying in Japanese would only confirm the old woman's suspicions. And she probably wouldn't believe that she's not, Japanese, right? So, because she doesn't have access to the language, it makes the idea of losing citizenship all the more fraught, right? Because once she's out with citizenship, is there anything left to tie her to her Korean heritage, right? So you can see like the shibboleth for racialization between Zainichi Korea and Korean America are quite different, right? So passing, is also something that's multifaceted and now without its advantages, right? But in each case, it's something that's projected onto her without her taking a conscious decision, right? But Ryoko's ambivalence toward passing for Japanese comes to a head when she and Miron are confronted by a young Black man who accuse them of being simpatico with white supremacy, and this is at the height of the riots, right? And then Ryoko explains to the young man that Miron explains to the young man that Ryoko is not Japanese, and then this causes the young man to recall his experience with Japanese Americans who treat him much more humanely than Koreans, right? And you could read Miron's denial of Ryoko's Koreanness, in two ways. You could read it as she do so because she's protective to Ryoko, wants to protect her, or as something that is like something that she's always felt, right? That she is Japanese, right? And Ryoko doesn't correct either of them. She chooses to pass in that moment, right? Or she's so paralyzed that she can't affirmatively correct the notion, right? And the entire novel has been about Ryoko's inability to self-signify her Koreanness beyond citizenship, language, or some essentialist token, right? So even though it serves an important function in defamiliarizing Japanese racial discourse, Sōka, the store still burns because Koreans and Black Americans, Zainichi, they don't know how to communicate effectively, right? So you can see how the novel occupies distinct history and context to step beyond what's naturalized. And this is what I mean by a diasporic minority transposition. So in 1943, Lieutenant Young Kim arrived in Camp Shelby in Mississippi to join the 100th Infantry Battalion, part of the famed 442nd Japanese American Regiment. And upon his arrival, his commander immediately offered him a transfer because he knew that Koreans and Japanese hated each other. And because not only was Young Kim Korean American, but he was also an officer. So that meant there were even more levels of alienation between him and the enlisted men, Japanese American regiment, right? And the story goes that Kim immediately refused and said, no, sir, I don't want to transfer. I'm American. They're American. We're going to fight for America. And that's, a great story, right? It's a great patriotic story. It makes sense, right? But that history doesn't tell the full story, right? Because around the same time in Los Angeles and Hawaii, Korean Americans were walking around with stickers that distance themselves from Japanese Americans. You can't see, I'll zoom in here. This is a lapel pin that's announced Korea's alignment with the US over Japan, right? And the Korean Americans will walk around these pins to distinguish themselves from Japanese Americans because they didn't want to be associated with them. And there was some talk at the time during the internments of Japanese Americans that Korean Americans would also be interned with them because they were technically considered citizens of the Japanese Empire, right? So Koreans were trying hard to distinguish themselves, right? And the point I'm trying to make here is that Korean America, Asian America is much more complicated, this kind of linear transition from immigrant to this kind of pan-ethnic Asian American solidarity, right? That there's another thread in the conversation that's been neglected. And what I'm trying to do is, with my readings of Pachinko and Motosulka, is that to uncover that dimension of the story that hasn't really been articulated. All right, thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. It's such a complex story. So if you're in the audience, please feel free to put your questions on the Q&A, and I'm in a position to ask questions. So while waiting the questions,
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Sure, whatever works.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Great.
Oh, I see. This is fine. Yeah. Maybe could you start to talk about maybe the rewarding and difficulties of doing this kind of research? I see a lot of boundary making that you are challenging, but at the same time, to make a sense, you constantly have to deal with this boundary. Like in the beginning, you mentioned about the disciplinary boundary between Asian American studies and Asian studies, and that artificially made boundary. But then in the talk, you're talking about space, language, citizenship, these cultural concepts projected on the peoples. I think at the point you mentioned arbitrariness of the boundaries, and just like in general, I just wonder how you deal with this kind of really fragmented, transient, like a moving boundaries.
Yeah. Well, I can answer that by telling you that it's work that it's, again, I don't want to overplay my hand here. Like, I'm building off a lot of work that's come before, particularly in Asian American studies that move towards the transnational and transpacific. And that seems to have resonated with people in Asian American studies, even if they don't have access to some of the texts that I am interested in exploring. What has been interesting and frustrating to encounter is that when with this exception of my invitation here and some other avenues, like I've tried to, early on, I tried to present this work at the Association for Asian Studies, right, at the AAS, and I kept getting rejected on my papers, and it was just after a while I just kind of gave up because maybe I hadn't articulated myself well enough, or the project was still early, but whether fair or not, I took that as a signal that Asian studies wasn't really interested in this kind of work, or perhaps wasn't quite sure what to make of it. And so that was, a frustrating roadblock. And now what's happened after the book came out is that there seems to be more reception. And I think perhaps, it's because the field has advanced, right? And I talked about how in Asian studies and area studies, there have been a lot more multilingual, multinational studies coming out that are much more comparative. And so it seems like a logical extension for that to apply to minority studies in the US and other contexts. And so, again, other studies have come out, like Anna Lee's Mandarin Brazil, which is quite a fascinating study of Chinese Brazilians. And so there does seem to be, that maybe it was a question of timing, but it was not an auspicious sign early on.
It's interesting, especially you ended up getting this position in the English department after all. That's a kind of solution too, or?
Yeah, and that's really an accident of history, because I kind of stumbled into this work just because of my own personal history, having gone to Japan after college and having encountered, Zainichi culture, not knowing anything about it before. It wasn't even on my radar. And so when I studied in graduate school, I always knew as a subject I was interested in exploring, but there was no like institutional pathway forward. I had to kind of cobble everything together, make friends and build networks with people in Korean studies and Japanese studies. And it was not something that, that the pathway wasn't already set. Like I had to just kind of do the work myself. And so that is, I think there's a critical mass of interest, but what I see as sort of a stumbling block for the future of this kind of work is maybe we need some institutional or structural reform in the kind of disciplinary silos we've built for ourselves, because you can't always count on people's personal accidental experiences leading to this kind of interdisciplinary work. I think the field would be much better off for kind of structured approach.
Well, thank you so much. Like, we have many questions, and many of them are so enthusiastically thanking you. The first question came during the talk from Jennifer Hall. Let me read. I believe that most, if not all, of the scholars you mentioned who are working on transnational, transpacific, or global Asia framework, you, Tina Chan, Lisa Low, etc., are actually scholars, I'd argue, more rooted in Asian American studies, and who have now moved into transnational, transpacific arenas. So I have two questions, she says. One, can you share the Asian studies scholars who are moving in the direction of the transnational, transpacific? Because I confess I'm more fluent in APA studies than Asian studies. And then the second question is, if there aren't many scholars in your answer to part one, can you speculate as to why APA studies scholars are doing this work more than Asian studies scholars?
That's thanks, Jennifer. Jen, thanks for that question. Yeah, there's a couple people that come to mind. I already mentioned a few in my talk that are coming from Asian studies who are moving towards Transpacific studies and racial studies that engage with racial formation theory. So I mentioned Anna Lee, Men of Brazil is a great book that explores the history of Chinese in Brazil. Amy Kwan's book, Intimate Empire, is not focusing on the US by any means, but it's a multilingual study that looks at the formation of Zainichi literature in the colonial Korean context. So it's engaging with Japan and Korea. Taka Fujitani's book, Race for Empire, which I also mentioned in the talk, is a really fascinating historical study of the racial formation of Koreans in the Japanese military. And his work draws a lot on racial formation theories and interrogates what he's calling polite racism as a way to kind of articulate how the Japanese Empire was so successful in integrating the Korean bodies into the imperial fold, but at the same time still discriminating against them as the other. And so you can see him, he's also doing comparative work with Japanese Americans' racialization. He does shows how Japanese Americans in the US military face a sort of similar conundrum. So that comparative framework is, the comparative study is very much in tune with the kind of work that I'm trying to do, working off his work as well. Lisa Yoneyama is another, famous figure in the fields who kind of traverses both fields and does comparative work. And sorry, the second part of the question, can you remind me?
Oh yeah, if there aren't many scholars in your answer to part one, so I think many. Can you speculate as to why APA studies scholars are doing this work more than Asian studies scholars?
Yeah, I think to answer that, I think it's symptomatic of the respective origins of the two fields, right? Area studies, whether fair or not, is often described as being more conservative, right? And has sort of this established lineage with intelligence studies and state apparatus. Asian American studies, because it's relatively new, doesn't have the same kind of legacies to deal with, the structural legacies to deal with. And so I think it is has more latitude to expand to different fields that, and it's not facing as much opposition from on high or intellectual opposition. But it's also, I think a natural response to what Candace Chu argues is sort of the limits of squarely rooting Asian American studies in social justice, domestic oriented projects that by going that pathway, it can be limiting for the field. And so by expanding out to Transpacific studies, the field can be richer for it. And also recognize that Asian American studies and subjectivity of Asian America is always going to be changing, because the migration policy in the post-1965 is not always going to be the case. Every generation is going to have to reframe and redefine what it means to be Asian American. And so the constant influx of immigrants is going to have to be grappled with.
Great, thank you. For the next comment question coming from Rossi Bayard Jones, I believe. Thank you so much for the fascinating presentation! I'm curious about how you would interpret Nozasu and Solon's Japanese love interests, particularly the characters of Akiko and Hana, and the racialized gender politics within those relationships in Pachinko. Do you, a couple more questions, okay. Do you interpret their roles as conscious reversal of political discourses, which often feminize Korea in contrast to a particular imperial Japan? Or are their characters simply a means of self-discovery for the male protagonist?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's not something I have dwelled too much upon. I do recognize, and something I talk about in another chapter of my book, how there is a kind of tendency, and not just Pachinko, but other books, as Zainichi books as well, to embody Japan through a female character, and especially like a love story, where it could be feed into this idea of the reversal of the dynamic, where Japan is rendered as masculine, created as feminine, and objectified. And so you can see in some Zainichi novels, the Zainichi male character protagonist understanding or accepting himself through the acceptance of a Japanese female love interest, right? And I haven't thought about more beyond that. I recognize that the character, I believe it's Hana, in Pachinko, she is, kind of similarly marginalized as Solomon, and perhaps that is sort of the saving grace of that tendency to embody Japan as a feminized love interest, that she comes to term with herself and her love for Solomon on her own terms. And I think that's how Lee kind of threads the needle.
Okay. The next question is Chris Mason. I missed the first part, so maybe you already talked about this, but were you able to find any connections between Korean Americans and Chinese Americans? Did they share any solidarity amongst their communities, either before, during, or after the war?
I mean, I'm not sure if I have a specific example other than the history of Asian America is intertwined with and I'm not doing it I'm doing a disservice by describing it this way, but history of political allegiances and a pan-ethnic Asian American solidarity that emerged in the 1960s. So and this is something I kind of contest in the book or want to complicate, but beyond that, I don't have a specific example for you, unfortunately.
Okay, so another big thanks from Christine Dene. Thank you for your talk, exclamation mark. I just learned recently about Korean Americans who were involved in interrogating Issei at Fort Missouri during World War II, and there were cases of violence against the Issei by them. How would their Issei and a Korean American working for the army fit into your analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not familiar with that history. I don't doubt it at all. But that underscores the very point of my book, is that there has been a narrative that took hold in at least Asian American studies that we have to kind of uncritically align ourselves with this pan-Asian American story of solidarity. But there are a lot of interethnic tensions, and just like your story illustrates, that complicates that story quite a bit. And by acknowledging those interethnic tensions, that also leads us to have to account for the different histories and the complexities of the different forms of minoritization and racialization that occurred in Asian America. And so, I also illustrate in the book that there were 340,000 South Koreans who, committed all kinds of atrocities in Vietnam as part of the Vietnamese War, as part of, as a partner to the United States. And that kind of history and the legacy of that is not really studied too much in the Asian American context. But I think, that would complicate that story, and I think be richer for it, that the scholarship would be richer for it.
Okay, so this is from anonymous attendee. Do you happen to know how Minjin Lee categorizes Pachinko? Does she see as an Asian American versus Korean American versus Korean diasporic? versus Korean literature? Do these categorization exist more for scholars than for readers?
I asked her this question. She never answered me. The way that I'm, this is conjecture, this is between you, me, and the internet, is that I understand there's a TV show based on Pachinko coming out fairly soon on Apple TV. And based on what I've read and seen, it seems to be a strongly international production that seems to kind of take the conventions of Korean dramas and internationalizes them. And from my understanding, maybe that's not the direction that the author had originally intended. And so if that's any indication of intent, and I use this term, I don't want to put too much weight in this term. I would say, it is a Korean American's projection or reading of Zainichi Korea, but I don't think she pretends that it is a representation. She is not the voice of Zainichi Korea, if that makes any sense, right? It is a way for this author to kind of engage in a conversation that would complicate the story of the Korean diaspora. But I think I'm assuming she would be the first one to say, I am speaking for all of Zainichi Korea. And of course, the Zainichi scholars that I've talked to, they would be very uncomfortable with that as well.
Thank you. So a couple more questions, comment from John Swain. Not really a question. I have argued for a number of years in my studies of Zainichi Korean and Okinawan contemporary theater and drama that we must acknowledge the cross-border, cross-cultural influences of creativity. It is notable that many plays in those bodies of work addressed American presence.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think this is something that a lot of scholars such as yourself and other scholars in the fields are recognizing. And again, I think that would open up possibilities, critical terrains that are neglected and really rich veins for mining.
So true. Okay. Okay, from Claire Rips Goodwin. Hello, thank you for the talk! Exclamation. Why did you choose the term racialization to discuss Zainichi Korean in Japan?
Right. So I had kind of alluded to this, and I guess I'll expand upon it a bit. In a scholarly context, what I have detected, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this is my generalization, is that in Asian studies and Korean studies or Japanese studies, or what you would call it, people who have studied Zainichi texts and histories tend to overemphasize colonial modernity as sort of the root of the Zainichi condition. And that has led to a kind of atrophying of the forms of contemporary racialization that occur in Japan. So you can see, like, with the Korean boom in the early 2000s, you saw attitudes shifting in Japan about Korean immigrants, right? And that was a very contemporary phenomenon that complicated the picture of the Zainichi in contemporary Tokyo, right? And I think that is interesting and should be explored. And the inverse holds true in Asian American studies. I don't want to say that one is better than the other. Like in Asian American studies, we tend to emphasize social racial formation, right? The social construction of race through culture and legislation. But we kind of underemphasize colonial legacies, right? That's what my book is trying to kind of rearticulate, right? So that is why I purposely and self-consciously chose racialization to describe the Zainichi condition.
Right. So a question from Yase Kuwahara. Thank you for an eye-opening speech. I'm just wondering how you see the relationships among Asian Americans. Is there a solidarity or hostility in general?
Well, yeah, it's complicated. The tortured history of the term Asian American, and you can see this as something that was projected onto the group by bureaucrats and people who are not Asian American. But that was accepted and used for the sake of political mobilization, expediency. But that's come with high costs because there is a sort of aggregation effect and a blunting effect that occurs. And so, why is it that, it's not just Asian Americans, but Asian American Pacific Islanders, right? And Asian Americans include everything from East Asian to South Asian to, Laotian, Cambodians. And if you look at if you disaggregate the groups, you will notice that, income levels, education levels, relative success in American society is it's a huge discrepancy. But as the term Asian American has taken hold as a powerful narrative, and the idea of Asian Americans being sort of the model minority and successful minority, that then underplays and ignores all the iniquities and structural iniquities that have occurred within the complexities of Asian America, right? So that, I think, is illustrative of pushback, and it's not just me; it's a bunch of scholars in the field pushing back against that notion, because then then that could come at a high social cost.
This complex racial politics, I think the Jennifer Ho's comment resonates. She says, once again, appreciate David talking about the complexities of Asian American solidarity, because he's right that in Asian American studies, we often gloss over this in favor of promoting a narrative of Asian American enfranchisement and legibility. Okay, so I think I read all of the questions. So if you have any more questions, please feel free to ask. It's a great opportunity. Oops, there was another. Okay, from Ayako Mizumura, our staff. Hi, Ayako. I know she brought her student. Thank you so much, Professor Ro, for the fascinating talk. Zainichi Korean remains Zainichi no matter how much assimilated to the mainstream Japanese society. Even naturalized Zainichi Koreans often identify themselves as Zainichi, but not as Japanese. If the Japanese government changes a law and grants dual citizenship, how would Zainichi identity be affected? Would they identify themselves as Korean Japanese, or do you think they would still remain Zainichi identity?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are nuances to the description that scenario that you're describing, and I don't pretend to speak for the Zainichi intellectuals who are doing this great work to kind of theorize what it means to be a contemporary Zainichi in Japan. What I can say is that because of the history of the Zainichi and because of sort of the legacy of the pressure to assimilate, right? That's always been kind of a complicated affair, even if you naturalize and still self-identify as Zainichi, right? That perhaps you will as third or fourth generation Zainichi, but it doesn't mean that your children will. This pressure to assimilate and not be different is fierce, right? And if you can pass, then the fear for many Zainichi is that they will naturally, through social pressure and time and inertia, will be, essentially become Japanese, right? And that Koreanness, that Zainichi-ness will dissipate, right? And so then the question then becomes for Zainichi intellectuals, okay, what is going to be the kind of defining shibboleth of our, racialization if it's not citizenship, right? Because, in the US and the Asian American context, just based on physical phenotype, there's always going to be a racialized difference, right? But the Zainichi don't have that phenotypical marker there that kind of already outs them as other, right? So I don't have a great answer for you. I've seen some intellectuals experimenting with other terms, like some intellectuals will actually use the term Korean Japanese, like they import the American word and phoneticize it in katakana. And that's a way again of kind of traveling through this third national space to renegotiate what it means to be Zainichi, right? So you can see people experimenting. It's not settled, and I'm loath to make predictions because I don't want to pretend to speak for the Zainichi at all.
Well, I have a question, which is, since I haven't really read all the books, which I'm really super interested in now after your talk, based on your talk, I'm originally fascinated about your approach, this like a nesting process. Here's a colonial legacy within Asia, but it's nested in and with this like a larger colonial history of the Western colonialism. But for some, one of the narrative you provided us and then stuck me is like the meaning of naturalization. Naturalizing Japanese and naturalizing into the US is totally different because of the different history. But then the question is, the Asian colonialism seems to be really critically interrogated, but in exchange of, in a sense, giving pardon to the Western colonialism, at least I think maybe the people's day-to-day understanding, for example, like a naturalizing American is kind of seems to be a natural thing to do, a good thing for the better future, versus naturalizing Japanese is a different one. Whenever like there's a racial or ethnic conflict between Japan, Korea, wherever the East Asia, the US is the intermediator to make a peace and a big brother, the father to rely on. So I just was wondering how you criticize or approach this larger frame of colonialism we are resigning, and yet we were put into kind of fight each other in a smaller scale of colonialism,
I don't want to give you the impression that I framed the US as kind of neutral arbiter. So I do take pains in the book to kind of position the US's role as not necessarily the great savior of the Zainichi by any means, right? But and the US has its own, of course, history of internal colonialism, of which Asian America is grappling with every day. Yes, if the question is like, do I make those distinctions? I try to.
Okay, yeah. All right. So Christine Denny, the Fort Missouri reference about East and Korean American comes from Carol Balkenberg. Sorry. Okay, so here's reference information. I'm sorry, and Commander. Okay, I think this is pretty much all questions you admirably handled, David. We'll check. Okay. I think this was a really, really amazing discussion. You provided a nice space to talk about many different things, from racial politics, gender politics, to disciplinary issues, and so on and so forth. So thank you so much. And once again, please give a big applause to Professor David Roll. Thank you so much for
Thanks for your
the
questions
talk tonight.
Thanks for the discussion. I appreciate it. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. So please have a wonderful evening, and please come to Business Symposium happening tomorrow. This is an in-person event on campus, and so if you're interested in doing or practice business in East Asia, please come to join us. Well, thank you so much again. And yes, okay.